Okay, I think we're live. Good evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe and wearing masks and reading mini biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that has made this program possible. Please note that for the moment, our very next event is on February 24th with the veteran foreign affairs correspondent Elizabeth Becker. She will be in conversation with Ann Nelson to discuss You Don't Belong Here, How Three Women Rewrote the Story of War. But tonight we are here to celebrate Peter Baker and Susan Glasser for their biography of James Baker, the man who ran Washington. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. He is the author of 6 books, including Obama, The Call of History, Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House, and Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution. Susan Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker. She has previously served as editor of Politico during the 2016 election cycle. She was a founding editor of Politico magazine and editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. She is the author with her husband, Peter Baker, of Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia, and the End of the Revolution. They are presently writing a book on the Trump presidency. So please look for all of these new books and old online at bookshops.org, a site that leads you to your local independent bookstore. We will have a conversation for about 40 minutes and then take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and I will be sure to get to as many as I can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour, around 7 Eastern Time. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, congratulations on this formidable accomplishment. We all know how hard it is to finish a biography. Now, to begin, I want to begin by quoting George Orwell. Writing a book, he once wrote, is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand. So, Peter and Susan, I ask you, what demon made you tackle James A. Baker, a biography that I think took you 7 long years to write?
Well, the external demon, thank you so much, Kai. It's really an honor to be with you. The external demon that made us take 7 years with it was very easy, and that was Donald Trump. We certainly did not expect for the book to take this long, and we're prepared to finish it in the aftermath of the 2016 election when, let's just say, events intervened in a dramatic way and kept Peter and I quite busy over the last 4 years. But I think we saw this actually as an opportunity of escapism in a way. It was really an opportunity to time travel out of our daily jobs in the gridlock and dysfunction of Washington and back to a sort of a previous moment in Washington's history, not necessarily one that we looked back on with, sort of rose-tinted glasses or with nostalgia necessarily, but certainly a moment in time when both the world was different and our politics were different, and they were much more functional. Baker is a story about competence and not incompetence fundamentally. And it certainly helped to cast in sharp relief our daily work as journalists for the New Yorker and for the New York Times.
Yeah, I think I would add just that it is a story about Washington as much as it is about Baker. Washington is the other character in the book in some ways. And while we started it long before Trump came along, I think the Trump era helped crystallize why the book mattered in some ways, because it helped us, think about Washington in different terms and how things have changed. What's different, what's the same, where the antecedents of today might have come from, and so on. And I think that gave the book extra resonance with extra demons.
Okay, so just I'm looking at my screen and I see half of each of you. I'm wondering maybe you need to scrunch together a little closer.
Okay.
Anyway, well, this book reminded me very much on a personal note of the first book that I wrote, a biography of John J. McCloy. McCloy was a powerful Wall Street lawyer who shied away from overt politics, but he was a fixer, like your portrait of Baker. And after The Chairman came out in 1992, this is a long time ago, and it took me 10 years to write that book, I was asked all the time about who is the current chairman of the establishment, because McCloy was regarded as the chairman of the East Coast foreign policy establishment. And I had trouble naming one, but should I have named Baker?
Well, we were inspired, I think, by your book and by Evan Thomas and Walter Isaac's book, The Wise Men, and books about, Avril Harriman and other, major figures of that era who, were in a Washington where ideology was important, partisanship was obviously a big presence, but it wasn't just about that. There was this idea that you had a responsibility to shape the world, that Washington ran the world, and that you had a chance to run Washington. Today's Washington is just, how can we get a small, tiny advantage in the next election? And there's never really a moment where we focus on governing. And I think that Baker, in some ways, was the logical descendant of the John McCloy and his era, figures.
Although I think there is an important difference, really, Kai, and probably why Baker didn't spring to mind in '92 when you were asked that question, which is that he defined his career and he understood his career in Washington as a product of Republican party politics. And he didn't see himself as a member, never mind the leader of a priesthood of international affairs experts, although he not only rose to become Secretary of State, but, by many measures was perhaps the most consequential Secretary of State since the immediate aftermath of the World War II era. But, Baker was not a man who was going to be a founder of the Council on Foreign Relations. He wasn't somebody who, wants to sit down and have a chat about the Treaty of Westphalia and the modern nation state. And so I think that's the reason why. He was a marriage of pragmatic politics, fixing, he just uniquely skillful at the art of running the White House, for example, as chief of staff. And then also the third ingredient was making that work at a moment when the existing international order was unraveling on his watch.
Right. No, your portrait of him is very complicated and nuanced, and you catalog all his wheelings and dealings, but it's not uncritical. You criticize some of his positions and actions. He after all was extremely conservative in his politics, and he was associated with a lot of controversy. But nevertheless, I sense in your narrative that there's a certain nostalgia looking back from our present day of the last 4 years of Trumpism, a certain nostalgia for this establishment or pragmatists, the idea of pragmatic power brokers coming to Washington and making things just work. I assume that's true. That's one of the themes of the book.
Celebrating incompetence, conversely, is not necessarily, that could be said to have, been the counterpoint as we are writing this book. Certainly, what's unfolding around us is an incredible tale that people will be writing books about for decades and generations to come of massive incompetence and the breakdown of the basic functions of government, both in terms of the executive branch and also in terms of the relationship between and among the branches. And so I don't think it's a celebration per se, as much as a case study in power, how it works. But there's no question that Baker saw, while he wasn't an extreme ideologue of any sort. And that's why he was able to deal with adversaries, whether they were Democrats on Capitol Hill or Soviets in Moscow. But he certainly saw his job as to do something. What was the point of being in government after all? Now, you could say, I think the critique of him and George H.W. Bush, his best friend and partner in, these sort of adventures in governing, the critique of them, right, would be that they had an artificial distinction in their mind that collapsed over time between what was acceptable and what one could do in electoral politics and in campaigning versus what one should do in governing, where they still had a much more rarefied conception and, a sense of even perhaps noblesse oblige, which sounds really out of step with the present moment we're living in. That those parallel buckets in which they viewed campaigning and governing have collapsed in themselves. And now we live in a permanent campaign in which governing apparently is optional. And look at this complete disaster, dumpster fire situation with not just the coronavirus in terms of public health, but in terms of the things that Jim Baker knew well, making deals with Congress, funding emergency packages. The idea that Congress from April took until over the New Year's holiday to pass a relief package, I think, and that tells you the difference between the Washington of then and the Washington of today. Right.
So people want, apparently, our sound volume to be up a little more. If you can, I don't know if you can adjust it, but try to do that. So on a personal note, I've just finished writing a biography of Jimmy Carter, which will be coming out in May. And Carter famously, he's written 33 books. He famously co-authored a book with his wife, Rosalind, which almost led to the collapse of their marriage. And I know from personal experience, collaboration is very difficult, can be. And my first collaboration on a biography was a disaster. I've had one success since then. But so I want to ask how your marriage survived writing this biography.
Well, first of all, I would say we're still married and we're still here speaking terms. So it obviously worked out okay. Look, hey, first of all, we're really looking forward to your biography of Jimmy Carter, by the way. This is something I've been looking forward to now for years. You told us a few years back that you were working on it. I got excited as a fan of yours and a fan of biography in general. And I think Carter has been an overlooked figure, and I'm glad that he's kind of coming back now in this period to be re-examined, because I think he's a fascinating figure. In terms of our working relationship, look, we got started as a relationship in the newsroom of the Washington Post. So we've always been doing this. This is how we met. This is what the basis of our initial, interactions were. We met in the newsroom of the Washington Post in January 1998. I was a White House reporter. Susan was a deputy national editor. And we ended up, working together on the Monica Lewinsky and impeachment story for like 13 months, day in, day out straight. And so, from our point of view, the personal and the professional has always been one. And we've written another book together. That one was harder, actually. The Kremlin Rising book on Russia we wrote when we came back from Russia. Susan was pregnant at the time. We actually turned in the book on the same day she had the baby. So Whoa. this time was kind of easy, which is good, because I think being pregnant for 7 years would have been a pain.
Yes. So let me ask you a few questions sort of about the art and craft of the biography. Your sources, I can see you relied heavily on interviews, but also on Baker's personal archive at Princeton. And I gather that that's a huge archive that he just turned over, and is it completely open? Is there anything that you were denied access to from his personal papers?
No, it's all now open, but at the time it wasn't. And so, he gave us access to the full archive. There's also an archive at the Baker Institute at Rice University, and some personal papers in addition. And I have to say, that was where the difference between our day-to-day work as journalists and having access not just to the occasionally faulty memories of octogenarian participants, but also to have this sort of voluminous record. Now, look, Jim Bakker is not a diarist. He's not somebody who, is given to sharing his innermost thoughts either in conversation or in writing. But there were so many revealing moments that gave us access, I think, to telling a more complete story. Obviously, probably the two most moving things in this book, and I don't think we expected it to necessarily be a moving book about a power player, but this correspondence between him and George Bush about the impending death of his first wife, Mary Stewart, from cancer, and in which he reveals her terminal diagnosis to Bush. It's not only a breakthrough moment, I think, for a biographer in the sense that, one of the questions we, of course, started out with was, well, how close were Bush and Bakker? How much was this a genuine personal friendship versus a professional partnership over time? What's the legend versus the reality of this relationship? Well, having that letter really, I think, revealed, just how close they were, because in the letter, Bakker talks about how he hadn't told anyone, not his mother, not his 4 sons, and not his wife, which also tells you something not really very flattering about.
That was a stunning anecdote. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, and then there's even this incredibly, even more poignant and powerful letter that his wife, of course, she knew that she was dying, even if Bakker and her doctor outrageously didn't tell her this. She did know, and she left behind her own letter for Bakker to be read on the occasion of her death, and it was hidden in her house. And after she passes away, her close friend Susan arrives at the house, goes and retrieves the letter from a bureau, gives it to Bakker, and it's, of course, this incredibly tearjerker of a beautiful letter, because this was a marriage, actually, that they both were still children, essentially, when they met each other. And he was a sophomore at Princeton, spring break, so they were just a love match from their teenage years on. And, she says this beautiful goodbye thing. Of course, the woman who delivered the letter goes on to become Bakker's second wife. And that was the other thing. I mean, as we're here in Washington covering politics, covering foreign policy, I do think that was the other thing, just writing a biography and having the chance to dig into the personal story. For the first 40 years of his life, Jim Bakker had not a damn thing to do with politics. And yet it was this very formative time. Not everybody's like this, but I love biographies, and I love the first part of biographies always. Sometimes lose interest in the second part, where I tend to know more about the
Right.
dazzling resume of the person. And Jim Bakker, I knew nothing about the first 40 years of his life. And that was actually crucial to who he ended up being in public life. And so for me, that's where the documents came in as well.
Yeah, well, let's talk about his early life. I mean, those early chapters, they really bring home the idea that Bakker sort of personifies, even today, sort of white male privilege. As a young man, he coasted through life. He came from a well-off family, ends up going to Princeton. He has a powerful father. He does exactly what his father expects of him, goes to law school, joins the family law firm. And yeah, he's not involved in politics until his early 40s. It's an extraordinary, and he's also comes off, even at Princeton. I love this, where you portray him at Princeton arriving, from Texas, wearing cowboy boots. But you have a quote from one of his friends saying that he, quickly could become very un-Texan. And then he could revert back. When he went back to Texas, he was a cowboy again.
Well, I think that actually tells you a lot about his success in Washington, because he was somebody who adapted to this, and it wasn't fake. I mean, he manages to adapt himself to whatever culture he's in, right? Because he did come from Texas and go to Ivy League and patrician East Coast schools. He had, been in both worlds. And so, one of his aides told us that, going with him to Capitol Hill was always very fascinating, because you'd walk in with him in the Jesse Helms's office, the cantankerous Southern, senator from North Carolina, crotchety tobacco state guy, and they would sit there and shoot the breeze about duck hunting. And then you go next door to Chris Dodd, right, the erudite, patrician New Englander Democrat, and they talk about opera. And both of these were real in some fashion with Jim Baker. He wore those cowboy boots, and he had monogrammed shirts, and he would spit tobacco, and he would debate the finer points of a good restaurant with a friend. And so I think that unlike George H.W. Bush, who had a hard time, I think, translating Connecticut Yankee into Texas and seeming authentic, Baker could find himself in different settings and make himself seem authentic.
The difference was, the real story is that he was both a child of privilege, but it was a world of enormous constraints and actually kind of a narrow world that Baker came from in a way. And, the overriding sort of story, I think, that we came away from his childhood and his growing up was really a story of a hyper-controlling father and a hyper-controlling, the legacy and the burden of his family name. He was actually the fourth James Addison Baker, both the son, grandson, and great-grandson of Texas Lords, even though he's James Baker III. Now, that's very confusing. I have to say, 7 years working on this book, we never got an adequate explanation. There was always a sort of, we weren't very good at counting, good old boy, kind of explanation for that. But basically, he was the fourth James Addison Baker. His great-grandfather had immigrated to Texas from Huntsville, Alabama to Huntsville, Texas. He actually became a friend of Sam Houston's, according to family legend. And, as it came down to Baker by the fourth generation, his dad was a World War I hero, but a very frustrated man, I think, in his own right. He had been, forced into the overwhelming legacy of his father, Baker's grandfather, known as Captain Baker. He was really like the dynamo of the family. He was the guy who was like the builder of the institutions of modern day Houston, including Rice University, where the Baker Institute is now located. And so Captain Baker looms so large. Baker's father, okay, here's one just minor example of this. When Baker was already a grown man, he had already graduated from college, he'd been in the Marines, he was married, he had a young son, he wanted to go to law school. He thought about going somewhere back east, maybe Harvard. No. Dad said, you're going to practice law in Texas, you have to go to the University of Texas Law School. Not only did Baker agree to that, but his father said, and you must pledge the same fraternity that I was in. And he said, Dad, are you kidding me? I'm a father. I don't need any of this sophomore bullshit. And his father insisted that he pledge this fraternity. He was hazed by undergraduates in violent, this was the 1950s. And to me, that tells you so much, I think, about Baker and where he came from.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk for a moment about the extraordinary relationship that he had with George Herbert Walker Bush, Bush one. It's just, it's a lifelong partnership. And yet there's also, you write about the sort of underlying rivalry. And I just find it a fascinating story. So how did that relationship, you think, evolve?
Well, they both, when we interviewed them, and we interviewed President Bush before he passed, they both used the word brother to describe each other. And I think it's interesting, it's important to remember that brothers have sibling rivalry as well. And so that's, it's a true relationship, not a fake relationship. We can't think of in history another president and Secretary of State who had a personal relationship that preceded their time in politics, that really knew each other as friends before they ever had, business on the public stage. And in this case, Baker and Bush have been friends and partners on the tennis court. Right, exactly. In the Houston Country Club for about 10 years before Baker even really got into politics. Their families played football on Thanksgiving together. They shared a cocktail at Christmas together. And so their relationship, precedes that. And I don't, other than say maybe JFK and Bobby Kennedy, I don't know you can think of a president who had a cabinet member who was that personally close. So over the course of their public career, obviously they were invaluable to each other. I don't think, certainly Jim Baker wouldn't be Secretary of State without George Bush. It's likely George Bush might not have been president without Jim Baker, but there were periods of stress. The biggest two we could think of would be the 1980 campaign when George Bush is running for the Republican nomination and losing to Ronald Reagan. And it takes his friend Baker to say, okay, look, it's time for you to drop out. You have lost. And if you want to preserve your viability to become vice president, you better do it now. And it takes a real friend to be able to tell somebody like that, because presidential candidates don't want to hear it. And again, in 1992, Baker doesn't want to come back to the White House to run the re-elect campaign, gets dragged back anyway, clearly doesn't have his heart in it, and they end up losing, and he gets kind of blamed by the Bush family, particularly Barbara. So over the course of their lifetime, there are ups and downs. But in the end, the last day of George Bush's life, it's Jim Baker who goes to his house, not once, not twice, but 3 times that day. And it's Jim Baker who's at his deathbed, literally rubbing his feet as the former president passes away. And I think that's a friendship that goes beyond politics.
So at the same time, Bush 1 brings Baker to Washington. And the other, this is incredible. Within 5 years of coming to Washington, Baker is chief of staff to Ronald Reagan. And he's running the White House. And your book is actually the first book that's really explained to me, I think, how the Reagan presidency operated. I confess, before I tackled Carter, I actually went out to the Reagan Library and did 2 weeks of research thinking I might want to do a biography of Reagan. And I couldn't get a handle on it because the papers weren't there. And Reagan didn't seem to write any memos, and there was no interaction. And so it's your book explains how the Reagan White House operated and how Baker plays this role where he fends off the sort of the extremist conservatives in the Reagan camp, and in a very pragmatic fashion makes things happen. He gets the tax cut bill passed. He prevents disasters from happening, and that's his value, I gather, to Reagan.
I think that's right. And in many ways, that is sort of arguably one of the things that Baker, who was obviously good at a lot of things, was very best at. I think there's a reason he's still considered the gold standard of White House chiefs of staff by Democrats as well as Republicans. He's also the only person, just as a footnote, ever to hold that job for 2 different presidents, because he did return to become White House chief of staff for Bush at the very end of his presidency. But that Reagan presidency, the ascension, first of all, is remarkable in its own right. He's run not 1 but 2 national presidential campaigns against Ronald Reagan, both Jerry Ford's. That's how Baker ascends in this remarkable fashion from an obscure position at the Commerce Department in 1975. Within 1 year, he's running Ford's, the incumbent president of the United States, running his campaign. And that all came about as a result of Baker being handed through another accident of timing. Jerry Ford's longtime political advisor was killed in a car accident, and his job was to count delegates for Ford at the convention. Well, the 76 convention ended up being the very last contested convention against Ronald Reagan. So Baker's handed that job of counting the delegates. He proves to be so good at it. He then becomes chairman and running the whole campaign for the general election in 1976, which Ford comes back but does not ultimately beat Jimmy Carter. So he runs against Reagan in 76, and then he runs Bush's campaign in the primaries, takes Bush from a nothing, literally an asterisk in the polls in the 1980 primaries, to becoming Reagan's chief competitor in the Republican primaries. But of course, Bush can't do it. So the fact that Reagan's people would reach outside their circle to Baker was extraordinary in and of itself. It tells you a lot about the infighting of that Reagan inner circle. 2 of Reagan's advisors really wanted to block Ed Meese, who had been Reagan's chief of staff and in California governorship. He was just seen as an administrative disaster. This quote that sticks with me is his briefcase was the place where papers went to die. And so then you have this sort of like hyper competent corporate lawyer who has also proven himself to be, just a natural on the political stage, comes into this very, ideological, infighting driven thing. A key asset, which I'm sure we can talk more about, Nancy Reagan. she was, of course, the major power broker, often unseen in that White House. And she was a fan of Jim Baker from day one and a supporter of his. And he also understood he needed to maintain her good graces throughout.
Right. Yeah, at one point you quote Baker describing his job in the Reagan White House as the shit detector. And he was very good at that. And then you make, as an example, an argument that I find intriguing, that the whole Iran-Contra scandal that happened under Reagan might not have happened if Reagan had actually appointed him as national security advisor when that appointment was actually blocked by Meese and the others. So to talk a bit about what Baker knew or did not know about the Iran-Contra scandal.
Well, look, one thing he understood was getting in trouble, right? So he comes to Washington in the end of the Watergate era. So his understanding of politics is you can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you don't watch yourself. And so from the very start, he is looking out for trapdoors, for trouble in a way that maybe others don't. And so he saw, I think, from the beginning, the problems and the dangers of this whole Central America fixation of the hard right inside the Reagan camp. In fact, in the first weeks of the presidency, he sits down with Michael Deaver. And Michael, we found this great oral history where Michael described this. He says, we're sitting down next to each other. He said, knees touching each other. We're that close. And he says to me, Deaver is describing this, it's our job, yours and mine, to stop these guys from getting us into a war in Central America. And Deaver hadn't even thought about it. That wasn't even on his mind. Of all the different things that he saw as the possible problems for this White House, he didn't even identify it. Baker did. And so, the Iran-Contra, of course, happens on the second term watch after Baker's gone over to the Treasury Department. At one point, he talks to John Poindexter, who's the National Security Advisor, and Poindexter says to him, hey, Jim, I just want to apologize for keeping you out of the loop. And Baker says, hey, that's the biggest favor you ever did me, he says. He was very happy to be out of the loop on that one. And there had been talk in the first term about how to get around congressional restrictions, for instance, on aid to the Contras. And Baker had warned them this would be an impeachable offense if you try to, worm your way around the law here. And his argument was used at a meeting of the NSC by George Shultz trying to shut down some of the hardliners. So Baker, I think, had he been there, I think it's reasonable to say Nancy Reagan thought so, Michael Deaver thought so. Had he been either in the White House as chief of staff or national security advisor when that happened, he probably would never have allowed that to happen.
Right. So let's touch a little bit more on some of the controversies that he was involved. There's everything from the 1980 DebateGate scandal, where the briefing books for Jimmy Carter were stolen, and there's also, notably in the 88 election, the Willie Horton issue. And your account of that, for instance, really shows that Baker enabled Lee Atwater. And he was, Baker was a pragmatist. He was, in his politics, more moderate than someone like Lee Atwater. But when it came to an election, oh my God, he seems perfectly prepared to do whatever was necessary to win. So talk about Lee Atwater and Baker.
Well, I think you just gave the answer there in a way. The truth is that George Bush was in a mess of trouble. And coming out of the 1988 conventions that summer, campaigns did start somewhat later, and Baker was not yet running the campaign until the convention. Bush was losing. He wasn't just losing to Michael Dukakis, he was losing by 17 points. And there was enormous fatigue after 8 years of Ronald Reagan, fatigue with Republicans, an exhaustion, a sense that the country was ready to move on. Bush was not exactly an inspiring figure. He'd had a sort of not so great rollout. He was seen as, lacking the vision thing. And frankly, if it's a choice between two career politicians and, essentially pragmatists, why not go with, the competent technocrat from Massachusetts? And so Baker is a cold-eyed realist when it came not only to a certain extent to his politics and how he viewed the world, but also when it came to how he, as a manager, and that's one of his great strengths. Certainly, you want to talk about the juxtaposition with the current administration, right? You have a president right now who loves people around him who tell him what he wants to hear. And Baker is almost the exact opposite. Some of these memos that we were able to see were ruthless from his aides, saying, just what kind of trouble they were in, or, what liabilities Bush faced as a candidate, and that sort of thing. And so Baker knew they were in big trouble. And that's the context for what became a withering negative assault on Dukakis that Baker authorized and was completely on board with. And Bush was too, of course. It wasn't just Lee Atwater going rogue and attacking Michael Dukakis.
Bush was on board with it too.
Yes.
And Baker himself came up with the idea of pushing the prison furlough issue against Dukakis. And it was Baker who came up with the idea, according to your text, of accusing Dukakis of being a card-carrying member of the ACLU.
Well, that's right. I'm glad you brought that up, because often this is reduced in our, sort of current times to just the Willie Horton thing. But the truth is, Willie Horton was a terrible racist dog whistle, but it was absolutely part of a broad-based assault on Michael Dukakis, and turning this essentially mild-mannered technocrat from Massachusetts into an un-American, unpatriotic, against the Pledge of Allegiance, card-carrying ACLU member, a wuss, a wimp, and somebody who would let a terrible, murderous person out on a furlough and be responsible in effect for this rampage. And so that's the context for Baker. He's not regretful of almost anything. He's not a guy who likes to look in the rearview mirror and second guess any of his chapters. He did allow in our conversations with him, and we did ask him about this, of course, that this might be one thing where they had gone too far. But then he immediately walked that back, which is also a kind of a very Baker thing.
Wow. So what did he think of Bush's pardons of Weinberger and the other figures in the Iran-Contra scandal that occurred, at the tail end of the Bush presidency?
Yeah, he was worried about that. He was worried that would make Bush look like he was guilty, that he was trying to cover something up, which is, of course, exactly what Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel, said. So they were all mad. They were mad at Walsh because in the few days before the 1988 election, Walsh issued a new indictment, a superseding indictment of Caspar Weinberger, who had been the defense secretary. And in that, in 92, sorry. This is in 92. And in that indictment, they had some information that suggested that Bush hadn't been fully forthcoming about what he knew about Iran-Contra. And that happened just in the last couple of days, and they believe it killed any momentum they had. Now, they probably are going to lose anyway. There are a lot of reasons why Bush is going to lose, but it just burned them. And so that was Bush's way of getting back at Walsh. Now, I've talked to Walsh, associates who worked on that case and say, no, this wasn't political. That was just Bush's interpretation of it. But there's no question that Bush and Baker perceived it that way. But Baker also, again, saw the dangers of the pardons and thought that would be, really a problem for Bush and that he would be taking it on himself. Bush decided he wasn't going to, worry about that.
So let's talk about Florida, 2000. My memory of Baker is just burned in memory of him coming down and doing what was necessary to make George W. Bush president. And it seemed so heavy-handed. But again, your account is a little more nuanced, and you show him coming down. He's called by the Bush family to come and rescue them. And he immediately understands that this is going to go to the Supreme Court. And of course, he's right. I didn't realize that at the time. I thought we were going to have a count. But he recognized that it was going to go to the Supreme Court, and there was no negotiations. It's really, again, I learned something from your chapter about this. It put it in perspective that he didn't even negotiate with Warren Christopher, the lawyer on the other side of the table.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite scenes actually in the book, because it tells you so much about both characters. Baker, as you said, is called immediately by George W. Bush and asked in, which, I think that the personal context for Baker, right, is that it's an opportunity at redemption to a certain extent. The toughest period in his relationship with the Bush family, unquestionably, was the aftermath of this very painful defeat of George Herbert Walker Bush in the 1992 campaign. And, Barbara Bush in particular, I think, was resentful. And then, so flash forward to George W. Bush's campaign. He's eager to be seen as his own figure, so he doesn't want to surround himself with his father's advisors. So Baker and others are kind of kept out of it. And they understand that, of course, but still, it just tells you so much that he wasn't asked to do much during the campaign. But a second that, W's in trouble, first call goes to Baker, but he flies down immediately that same day to Florida. He and Warren Christopher is invited to be, kind of Gore's version, the former Secretary of State, very patrician, but very different character. Democrats we talked to said as soon as they knew that it was going to be Baker versus Christopher, they knew that, Baker somehow was going to find a way to pull it off. And so, they have this meeting set. And Christopher has prepared very carefully as if for a negotiation with the Soviets. He's got a plan A, a plan B, a plan C. He's carved out, the entire morning on his schedule for this meeting. Jim Baker waltzes in, hey, man, nice to see you, Chris. What's going on? Essentially says, yeah, I don't know why we're here. What is there to talk about? My guy won, and I'm here to make sure that the victory is preserved. And the meeting is over in 15 minutes. And I think that really tells you an awful lot about his approach to Florida, and that he was there. He wasn't a lawyer for the Constitution, baby. He was a lawyer for George W. Bush.
Yeah.
But the thing I would add, though, is what we thought at the time was heavy-handed and hardball. Today looks civilized, yes, and, restrained by comparison, right? So Florida, unlike what we have today, the entire presidency came down to one state. There was a difference of 357 votes after the machine recount, which is automatic. 357 votes for the presidency. Now, that's nothing like today. Today, we're talking about 3 states, tens of thousands of votes in each state. No, there's no way you can change tens of thousands of votes with any kind of recount. But in Florida, there was a real issue on the table, which side had won. And they fought it out. And they fought it out vigorously, and they fought it out ruthlessly, maybe. And they used every tool they had, but they fought out within the system, Right. And when it was over, you had people who believed in the system. You had Al Gore, who gave a very gracious concession speech at the end. It says, I don't agree with the Supreme Court decision, but George W. Bush is now my president. And George W. Bush gave an equally gracious victory speech. He says, I'm president of all Americans, not just the ones who voted for me. And they believed in the system. And I think that's what's different today. People say, well, what's different between this and Florida? Here you've got a president who's making up baseless fraud claims, no basis. Even his own attorney general says so. And he will not. He's looking for every possible way to overturn the obvious will of the voters, and it's just a very different sort of
and Al Gore, in fact, was the one who gavelled the victory of George W. Bush in the electoral college when Congress met to
which Pence may do tomorrow, or maybe not.
Maybe not.
Maybe he's going to get a terrible cold and be unable to show up.
So Baker is even after 2000 and that ruthlessness, he's still friends with the Washington Post, Meg Greenfield. He enjoys having dinner with Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post.
Co-chaired a commission with Warren Christopher.
Right. He did some things with Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy
absolutely.
Carter.
And yet also he could be very tough. He apparently drew the line with Bibi Netanyahu and barred him from the State Department when Baker was Secretary of State. What was that all about?
That is one of my favorite stories. And actually, one of the best stories that's not in the book is a story about Netanyahu that Tom Brokaw told us in response to the book. I wish it was in the book, but, at the time, Netanyahu was an up-and-coming official in the Israeli foreign ministry. And he comes to Washington. He asked Brokaw, I need to understand a little bit about who this guy is. Brokaw says, great, take me to breakfast and I'll tell you what you need to know about Jim Baker, the Secretary of State. They go to breakfast, and Brokaw says, well, you know much about turkey hunting? Bibi says, no, I'm from Philadelphia. I don't know about turkey hunting. And he says, well, listen, Jim Baker loves turkey hunting more than anything in the world. He gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning. He slathers makeup all over his face. He goes and he sits outside in the freezing cold, and you have to sit still for hours waiting for that bird. When he finally gets his eye on him, he shoots his head off. And that's what you need to understand about Jim Baker. So it's really, I do think it's a great story. But Jim Baker, got Netanyahu was the turkey in this story. He got furious with Netanyahu, who he felt had criticized the United States for all that it had done for Israel. And previous secretaries of state would have been peeved about it, but certainly would not have done. Baker got so mad at one quote that Netanyahu gave. He said he's persona non grata at the State Department, and he physically banned him from the premises of the State Department for more than a year, much to the dismay of his advisors on the Middle East, who were tearing their hair out and desperate to do something about it.
So we're running out of time, alas. But I want to ask you a little bit about Baker and Trump, because towards the end of the book, you actually have a scene where he's being a loyal Republican, trying to advise the candidate Trump, who is apparently on the verge of taking the nomination, and encouraging him to move to the center and act a little more presidential. And of course, it doesn't happen. And then 2 years later, in the midst of all this Trump chaos, Baker told ex-President Obama, the responsible center in American politics has disappeared. So that's quite an admission by Baker. And yet I was disappointed and even surprised to learn that he nevertheless voted for Trump in 2016. And I don't know, did he vote for him in 2020?
He did.
Oh my God. So how do you explain that?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And the thing is, we had this conversation with him as biographers, right? You talk about writing a biography, and Kai, there's a difference between writing a biography of somebody who's around to talk it through, and then there's writing a biography of somebody who's not. In this case, we had 5 years of conversation with Jim Baker about
70 hours.
70 hours, but in every one of these interviews, Trump would come up just because it was almost inevitable, right? Yeah. We watched him struggle with this. We watched him, he says he really was turned off by Trump in every way that many Republicans are. He called him crazy. He called him nuts. Those are words he used, not us. He was just offended by the charlatan carnival barker nature of it. As you say, the advice he gave Trump went straight into the circular basket. And yet he didn't break from him. Now, in Baker's mind, there was a compromise here, because with Baker, there's always a compromise. And his compromise was that he wasn't going to help him. He wasn't going to endorse him. He was never going to appear in public with him or take some job, but he was going to vote for him. And his argument is, look, I'm a Republican. I don't believe in Democratic policies. I'm still a Republican, even if my party has left me. That's the way he put it with us. And I think, it's important to understand that, because I think otherwise, how do you understand how many Republicans have stuck with Trump, even though he's not their kind of guy? I'd say most members of Congress who are Republican probably share Baker's view of Trump, and yet they have supported him, or at least stayed quiet up until recently, at least. And I think that tells you a lot. It's a parable for the modern Republican Party. The establishment ended up acceding to Trump, even though he mounted a hostile takeover of their party.
Well, I have to confess, at the end of reading your book, I sort of felt like the chapters that I was so impressed about on Baker and the Reagan presidency helped me to understand the Trump era. Because in a way, Reagan paved the way for Trump. He too was a disruptor, an outsider who was running against the establishment, like Jimmy Carter, of course, too. So there's this tradition in American politics, but Reagan sort of took it to an extreme, and Trump took it right over the edge of the cliff.
So, Kai, I think that's part of the explanation for the almost unexplainable Baker voting not once but twice for a man he thought was crazy, because he actually made this Reagan analogy in conversations with us. And wow. I think at least initially, that, part of it was that he thought he had been wrong and misjudged Reagan initially, and that the Republican establishment had this fear of Reagan as an outsider, and he was crazy, and he was going to get them into a nuclear war, and he was just an actor. And, then he had gone on to work with Reagan and to admire him, to perhaps see him as he wanted to see him, as a sort of successful politician and pragmatist, and not necessarily the Reagan revolution's architect. But so, Baker's version of Reagan, I think, informed the possibility that he saw in Trump as a disruptor, as a politician. Now, that can explain his vote in 2016. It doesn't explain his vote in 2020. And that's where I think that comment that he made to Peter, just a couple months, by the way, after telling both of us at a lunch in Washington that he would consider voting for Joe Biden, he volunteered that. He said, yeah, I like Joe Biden. He's my kind of Democrat. That seems like that would be a good idea. And then a couple of months later, he said, no, don't say that. I'm going to vote for Biden because I'm still a Republican, even if my party's left me. So, as a biographer, right, when your subject tells you something over and over and over again for 5 years, we basically asked him the same question and he gave us versions of the same answer. I think ultimately we had to realize, okay, well, this was helpful to us because he was telling us how he wanted to be seen. First of all, that he's choosing at the age of 90, at the end of his life, he's no longer in Washington. He's not responsible, for the Trump presidency, but that he's choosing a partisan identity for himself. That speaks to who he is. It's not us. We asked the question every possible way you could ask the question.
I think it's also about, one last thing I say about it is I think it's also about his understanding of power.
Yeah.
Like, I think his understanding of power is you have it if you're inside, you don't if you're not. And if you're not, he's not a revolutionary, he's not a rock thrower, he's not going to be the guy who who puts himself outside the tent and says you're wrong. I want nothing to do with you. And that even though he's not trying to influence anything anymore, it just instinctively, it's not in his nature to be the rebel inside his own party. And I don't know that doesn't, this is not excusing or explaining, it's just trying to understand. And I think that his nature is not to put himself outside the power structure.
Well, let's turn to a few questions from our virtual audience. Actually, one of them was right on this point. Are you surprised that Secretary Baker has not been heard from in public about Trump's considerable deviance? But I think you've just answered that.
He did give us one interview about making the comparison to Florida right after the election, and it criticized Trump for saying stop the count. He says, look, whatever we did in Florida, we never said stop the count. We wanted there to be a count. It's pretty hard to defend that, he said, in a democracy. So he criticized Trump about that, but he hasn't said much since then.
Right. Let's see, another question. How do you view George W. Bush's performance as president? That's pretty broad, but.
Look, he was very critical of the invasion of Iraq. He thought it was a mistake beforehand. He didn't break with Bush in the way that Brent Scowcroft, who had been his father's national security advisor, Scowcroft wrote an op-ed warning against the invasion of Iraq. It was taken really great umbrage at that, both by Condi Rice, who saw Scowcroft as a mentor, and by Bush himself, who saw it as a shot across the bow from his father and his father's advisors. Interestingly, Baker, managed to, sort of run the middle, as he often did. He had his own op-ed that was, pretty clear if you read it in, understood Baker speak, that he was strongly against it. And in our conversations with Baker, by the way, he was scathing about the invasion of Iraq, saw it as a terrible mistake, not only in and of itself, but also the long-term consequences in the Middle East, which he had accurately foreseen in advance. He then became the head of the Iraq Study Group, saw it as an important role that he could play. Didn't ultimately work out that way, but that was really his last major assignment on the Washington stage. He remained a loyal Bush family friend and promoter, endorsed Jeb Bush in his final ill-fated, run in the 2016 presidential primaries. he always identified himself as a sort of Bush family partisan, but I think he made it very clear that the foreign policy of Bush 1 was still the foreign policy view that he believes in.
Right. Here's another question from early in the biography. Was Baker's entry into national politics his rebellion from the narrow and rather suffocating constraints of his Houston family's expectations? Was it a rebellion?
Yeah, I think it was. I do think it was, right? For 3 generations of James A. Baker said the family mantra was don't do politics. And he went along with it until he was 40-ish or so. And he was restless at that time. Even before his wife died of cancer, he was restless. And after she died, Bush came along and said, you need to take your mind off it, come work in politics with me. So I think it was. And his father, by that point, had faded, was no longer the force in his life that he had been, so he didn't object to it. It's a great anecdote. His son told us late in life, Baker was talking with his mother, who was in her 90s at that point. She was saying, now, what's your job again? And he said, I'm Secretary of State, Mom. Secretary of State of what? The whole United States, Mom. Oh, that's nice. She said, I don't think your father would have allowed that. And the idea that, right, that his father would have somehow looked down on the idea of him being Secretary of State, I think does tell you a lot about him and the upbringing he had.
So here's a question from Matt. You call him a fixer. You call Baker a fixer. Can you comment on the most significant thing he fixed?
Well, one thing that springs right to mind is what happened after that very divisive and ugly 1988 presidential race. And, we're used to thinking of Baker and Bush as sort of the team that ended the Cold War. And we haven't talked, but we should talk certainly the negotiations that came after the fall of the Berlin Wall for German unification, I think were the pinnacle of Baker's career as a diplomat. But actually, it was the very first thing that he did, which I would say is one of his great acts of Washington fixing. After this terrible divisive fight with the Democrats, who did he negotiate with? Who did he sit down with first? It was the Democrats on Capitol Hill, Jim Wright, Speaker of the House, and he decided that we've got to take the divisive politics of Central America off the table in Washington. This is what had led to Iran-Contra, which we talked about. This was the constant push and pull between the Reagan executive branch and Wright, who had taken on as Speaker of the House a very unusual role, actually, in foreign affairs and trying to forbid the Reagan administration to spend any more money on the Contras. And it was to get around that Iran-Contra was designed. And so Baker very smartly comes in and says, I'm not going to be bogged down and have my tenure as Secretary of State ruined by this BS. And he sits down and he makes a deal with Wright, and essentially immediately, boom, off the get-go, takes off the table perhaps the most divisive single foreign policy issue in Washington of the entire previous decade.
In tandem with Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
And I think that, we talked to Carter, and I know you obviously have, but we talked to him about Baker, and he said he liked Baker. He thought Baker was the one guy who treated him, well after he left office. And Baker told us, he says, I'm the only Republican maybe who say good things about Jimmy Carter, but I like him and I work well together. And he by the two of them together, they convinced Ortega to stand down after that election in 1990. And that was, I think, a pretty good example of fixing.
Right. So there's another question about Sandra Day O'Connor. Did Baker, was he close to her? Did he talk to her when she was on the Supreme Court? Did he help her get that nomination?
He did. And that's another great example, in my view, of where, ideology can often be overrated or overstated, I think, sometimes in histories, especially actually histories of the Reagan presidency, to your point earlier. This is something where it really mattered that Jim Baker was the chief of staff when Reagan was president. And Reagan had talked about appointing a woman to the Supreme Court when he was a candidate on the campaign trail. Baker was one of the proponents of O'Connor, and the conservatives were really up in arms about this prospective appointment of O'Connor. They actually correctly, as it turned out, presciently, as it turned out, were worried that she would not be a reliable ally to them on the Supreme Court, and they were demanding a meeting with Reagan to press their case in person. Baker physically blocked them from meeting with Reagan in the Oval Office, and I think was a key reason why O'Connor had that sort of history-making appointment on the court. And to me, It's a story about, sort of personnel is policy. And that ideology is only part of what makes up an administration.
So here's a final question for the two of you, a little personal. As journalists, how do you stay calm through all the chaos?
Who says we stay calm? Well, look, it's been a very eventful few years, obviously, lately. We have been blessed to be able to see and cover a lot of amazing events, some of them very disturbing and some of them not. And I think that, I've been doing this around 35 years or something like that. I guess you get used to it after a certain amount of time, but I don't know.
No, I mean, look, you don't get used to what's been happening in Washington the last few years. I think the difference is that we had this incredible opportunity to be foreign correspondents earlier in our careers. And, I covered the Battle of Tora Bora for the Washington Post in Afghanistan. I should say I was completely unprepared to be an actual war correspondent. And that was actually the first time I ever heard a gun fired. I'm from Montclair, New Jersey. I not something I had in my previous experience. The difference about that and those experiences, and Peter and I covered the war in Iraq and other events after 9/11, Putin's rise in Russia. The difference was that it's something else when history's happening to other people versus here in Washington. That's where we've spent most of our careers. And I think seeing the disruptions of the last few years, seeing, day after day of stories that actually were unthinkable and nonetheless are happening. I mean, we're talking on January 5th, 2021, 8 weeks after the presidential election. Tomorrow, January 6th, is when Congress is literally supposed to open the mail and undertake the most ministerial of functions in the Constitution, which is simply to say, yes, we got your letter, Electoral College. Thanks a lot. We're done. And nonetheless, we've injected a level of drama. We have a situation where, you have one of the two parties essentially taking a significant minority chunk of it, taking a position against the Constitution itself. And history is different, and it's much more alarming when it's happening right here outside your front door. So I wouldn't say that I've been used to, Washington as it's been the last few years. If anything, I think Peter and I are very lucky because we had the opportunity to cover previous moments in Washington. We did not cover Jim Baker. We weren't old enough to do that. But this study of him, and then we both came after we graduated from college. I've been here since the Clinton presidency. And so we have a sense at least of what's being blown up because we've, been around to at least understand, what different iterations of our politics have looked like. It's really been a crazy time here in Washington.
It has indeed. Well, listen, on that note, we'll end this. I really want to offer my congratulations. It's a terrific book, whether you approve or not of the politics and career of James Baker. His biography is a window into sort of how power works in Washington, how it worked in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I recommend the book highly. It's well written. You can dip into any page and be fascinated by the anecdotes and stories. So congratulations, Peter and Susan, and thank you very much for doing this. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation for sponsoring this event. And please join us for our next event, I think on February 24th. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Good night.